If a duke fails to produce an heir within 90 days, he loses everything. The words echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling of Ashford Manor as the attorneys rolled up their parchment and stepped back into the November wind, leaving Duke Alexander Ashford alone with the ticking of the tall clock that had marked his family's power for over a century. Outside, frost silvered the 12 acres of winter fields stretching beyond the iron gates, but inside, something colder settled in his chest. He had 30 years of discipline behind him, a title earned by bloodline and burden, and now his legacy had been reduced to a single demand: an heir. Society expected him to choose a polished debutante, a woman bred for ballroom smiles and quiet compliance. Instead, that same evening, he sent for Emily Carter. She entered his study with steady steps, her plain black dress still dusted with flour from the kitchen, her hands folded neatly despite the tremor she fought to hide. She was 23, white as winter light, with eyes that carried a patience far older than her years. She had served at Ashford Manor for 6 months without once drawing attention to herself, and perhaps that was why he chose her. She belonged to no rival family, no gossip circle, no ambition anyone could see. The fire cracked between them, throwing gold across the dark wood shelves as Alexander regarded her with the same measured composure he used in courtrooms and council chambers. "You understand the position I'm in," he said quietly, his voice controlled, almost detached. Emily did not answer at once. She knew enough of the manor's whispers to understand. 90 days. An heir. Or the Ashford name would pass to a distant cousin already circling like a hawk. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her tone even though her pulse thundered in her ears. He stepped closer, not invading, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the gravity of his decision. "I require your assistance," he said. No anger, no cruelty, just a statement as firm as stone. Her breath caught. Assistance. The words sounded clinical, almost harmless, yet the weight of it pressed against her ribs. "If you refuse," he continued, eyes steady on hers, "your mother and brother will be dismissed from the estate cottages by week's end." Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Emily's chin lifted despite the threat. She did not plead. She did not cry. She only searched his face as if trying to find the man behind the title. "And if I agree?" she asked softly. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to reluctance. "Then I will ensure your family is protected," he answered. The clock ticked once, twice. Somewhere in the hall, a door closed against the cold. Emily Carter understood in that moment that her life had narrowed to a single choice measured in heartbeats. What neither of them understood yet was that the first night of their agreement would not be defined by duty or power, but by the truth neither of them was prepared to face. Emily did not leave the study immediately. She stood there as the fire settled into low embers, as if waiting for the walls themselves to object to what had just been decided. Duke Alexander Ashford moved back toward his desk, placing both gloved hands against the polished oak as though steadying himself. He had issued commands in war councils and estate disputes without hesitation, yet this felt different. Too personal, too deliberate. "You may speak freely," he said at last, without looking at her. Emily drew in a slow breath. "Then I would ask for terms." That caught his attention. His eyes lifted, cool and analytical, but not dismissive. "You are in no position to negotiate," he replied, though the edge in his voice lacked true cruelty. "Perhaps not," she answered quietly. "But if this is to be an agreement, it must protect more than your title." The clock ticked again. Outside, the wind brushed frost against the tall windows. Alexander studied her with renewed focus. She did not tremble now. She did not beg. She stood as though her spine had been forged from iron instead of fear. "What terms?" he asked. "My family remains in the cottage regardless of outcome," she said. "And my name is not spoken in scandal. If society must know anything, they will know nothing." A faint, almost imperceptible shift passed through his expression. She was not naive. She understood exactly what the whispers would cost her. "You presume I would allow gossip," he said evenly. "I presume society will create it regardless," she replied. For the first time that evening, silence felt less like a weapon and more like a recognition. He nodded once. "Your family will remain protected, and your reputation will remain intact. That I can promise." She searched his face, measuring the weight of his word. Duke Alexander Ashford did not make promises lightly. When he spoke, estates rose or fell. Finally, she inclined her head. Then I will assist you. The words settled between them with startling finality. He did not smile. He did not move closer. Instead, he stepped back, increasing the distance as though to remind them both of the boundaries that would define what lay ahead. You will be relocated to the East Wing tomorrow, he said, voice formal once more. Discretion is paramount. Yes, Your Grace. She turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by a single lamp casting long shadows across the marble floor. You asked for an heir, she said softly, without turning around. But what happens if you find something else? The question lingered like smoke. Alexander did not answer. He could not. Because for the first time since the attorneys had spoken those cold, calculated words, he felt the faintest crack in the fortress he had built around himself. Not because he desired her. Not because he doubted the necessity. But because in her composure, in her refusal to surrender her dignity, he sensed a strength that could not be commanded. When the study door closed behind her, the Duke remained motionless, staring at the dying fire. 90 days. An heir. A contract forged in frost. And yet, beneath the rigid structure of duty, something entirely unpredictable had begun to stir. The East Wing had been closed for years, its corridors preserved in careful silence. Yet by morning the dust had been cleared, fresh linens laid across the four-poster bed, and a fire lit in the marble hearth that overlooked the frozen lawns stretching nearly 20 acres beyond the manor gates. Emily Carter stood at the tall window of her new chamber, watching pale sunlight spill across the frost like powdered glass. Nothing about the room felt real. The silk drapes, the carved wardrobe, the thick wool rug beneath her boots. It was comfort without belonging. A gilded cage disguised as generosity. A soft knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hargrove, the housekeeper, entered with a composed smile that revealed nothing. His Grace has requested privacy for this wing, she said evenly. Meals will be brought here. You are not to return to the servants' quarters. Emily inclined her head. No questions were asked. No explanation offered. In a house this large, silence was the strongest currency. By late afternoon, the manor hummed with restrained curiosity. Footsteps slowed near the staircase. Conversation stopped when doors opened. Emily felt it, even without seeing it. She had crossed an invisible line. Downstairs, Duke Alexander Ashford reviewed estate accounts he had read twice already without comprehension. The numbers blurred. $10,000 in seasonal yield. 300 head of cattle. 50 workers dependent on his decisions. Yet none of it seemed as pressing as the awareness that Emily Carter now occupied the East Wing. This had been his choice. Calculated. Necessary. He reminded himself of that as he signed correspondence with steady ink. At dusk, a storm began to gather beyond the iron gates, clouds rolling low across the sky, wind pressing against the tall windows like an impatient visitor. A servant announced that dinner had been prepared in the smaller dining room adjoining the east corridor. Alexander dismissed the footman and stood alone for a moment before walking upstairs. When he entered, Emily was already seated at the long walnut table, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress provided from the manor wardrobe, modest and unadorned, her hair pinned back in quiet defiance of the situation. Candlelight flickered between them, softening the sharp lines of his expression. You have been settled, he said, taking the seat across from her. Yes, Your Grace. The formality lingered, thick and deliberate. Silverware rested untouched between porcelain plates. This arrangement, he began, voice low, remains bound by the terms we discussed. Discretion, respect, and dignity, she added calmly. His gaze lifted at that. Yes, he said after a moment. And dignity. The storm outside intensified, rain striking the windows in steady rhythm. Inside, the air felt suspended, charged not with desire but with awareness. Two people seated 12 feet apart, bound by an agreement neither had ever imagined. When the meal ended, neither rushed to stand. The fire in the adjoining hearth crackled softly. Emily rose first. If there is nothing further, Your Grace, I will retire. Alexander watched her as she moved toward the doorway, steady, composed, as though she had not just stepped into a future that could redefine both their lives. Emily, he said quietly, the first time he had spoken her name without title or distance. She paused. This will not be easy. She turned slightly, meeting his eyes without fear. No, she replied. But neither of us chose the easy path. When the door closed behind her, the Duke remained seated in the dim light, listening to the storm roll across Ashford land. 90 days had begun, and though duty had drawn the line, something far more complicated had begun to take shape in the quiet spaces between them. The storm did not fade with morning. It settled over Ashford Manor like a warning, low clouds pressing against the gray sky, while cold rain streaked down the tall windows of the east wing. Emily had barely slept. The fire in her chamber had burned low hours before dawn, and though the room remained warm, unease lingered beneath her ribs. Today was no longer preparation. Today was expectation. She stood before the mirror, fastening the final button of a pale ivory gown laid out for her, simpler than those worn by society ladies yet far removed from a servant's uniform. The fabric felt unfamiliar against her skin, like a reminder that she now occupied a place neither fully hidden nor fully acknowledged. A quiet knock sounded just after 7 o'clock. "His Grace requests your presence in the library," came Mrs. Hargrove's composed voice. Emily nodded, though the housekeeper could not see her through the door. When she stepped into the corridor, the manor seemed unusually still. Even the floorboards carried her footsteps with softened restraint. Downstairs, Duke Alexander Ashford stood by the tall, arched window of the library, watching rain blur the view of the front gates nearly 100 yards away. He had reviewed the estate calendar twice before realizing he had not absorbed a single detail. He did not fear duty. He feared what might accompany it. When the door opened behind him, he did not turn immediately. He allowed himself one steady breath. "You sent for me," Emily said quietly. He faced her then. The morning light filtered through the glass, illuminating the calm set of her features. She did not look fragile. She did not look defiant. She looked resolved. "Yes," he answered. His voice carried none of the sharp command it once had. "We cannot delay what has been agreed." The words hovered between them, formal yet weighted. She inclined her head once. "I understand." Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. He stepped closer, stopping several feet away, enough distance to maintain propriety, close enough to see the faint tension in her clasped hands. "If at any moment you wish to withdraw from this arrangement," he said, tone deliberate, "you will speak. I will not proceed against your will." The statement surprised even him. It was not required. It was not strategic. It was necessary. Emily looked up at him fully then, something soft flickering behind her steady gaze. "You have already given my family protection," she replied. "I will not dishonor the terms." Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the fields. Inside, the library felt suspended in time. He extended his hand, not in possession, but in invitation. After a brief pause, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cool from the corridor air. His were steady, though his pulse betrayed him. Together, they moved toward the private corridor that led to the west chamber reserved for the Duke alone. The fire inside had been lit hours earlier, casting warm light across polished floors and dark wood walls. Emily paused just inside the threshold. The room did not feel ominous. It felt intimate in a way that demanded honesty. Alexander released her hand first. "This is not a command," he said quietly. "It is a choice made under circumstance." She met his eyes without hesitation. "Then let it be a choice we both stand by." The storm outside intensified, rain striking the windows in sharp rhythm. Within the chamber, however, there was no rush, no cold detachment. Only two people standing at the edge of something neither fully understood, aware that the moment about to unfold would alter more than titles or lineage. It would alter them. The door closed with a quiet click that seemed louder than thunder. For a moment neither of them moved. The fire in the west chamber burned steadily, casting amber light across the high ceiling and the long shadows of two figures standing several feet apart. Emily felt the warmth of the room against her skin, yet a different chill lingered beneath her ribs. Not fear, not regret, awareness. Duke Alexander Ashford stepped toward the hearth, removing his coat with measured calm, placing it carefully over the back of a chair as though ritual could steady the weight of what lay ahead. "You may sit," he said gently, gesturing toward the armchair near the fire. She did not. Instead, she remained where she was, hands loosely clasped, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "If we are to do this," she said softly, "let it not feel like a transaction." The words struck him more deeply than any accusation could have. He had approached the evening as necessity, a timeline, an obligation. Yet standing before her now, he saw not a solution to an inheritance crisis, but a woman who had placed her trust in his restraint. He crossed the room slowly, stopping an arm's length away, close enough to sense her breath, far enough to preserve her space. "It will not," he replied, voice lower now, stripped of authority and title. The storm outside intensified, rain tracing restless patterns against the tall glass windows. Inside, time slowed. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek with deliberate care, giving her every opportunity to step back. She did not. Her eyes closed briefly, not in submission, but in decision. The tension between them shifted. It was no longer cold duty. It was fragile trust. He rested his forehead lightly against hers, breathing in the faint scent of lavender from her gown. "Tell me if you wish me to stop," he murmured. "I will not," she answered, steady though her pulse raced beneath her calm exterior. What followed was not rushed. It was not commanded. It was quiet, careful. The fire crackled, the wind moved against stone walls built over a century ago, and in that sheltered space the rigid boundaries of power softened into something unexpectedly human. When at last the room fell still again, Alexander remained awake, staring at the ceiling beams carved with his family crest. Emily lay beside him, her breathing slow but not yet asleep. He realized with a clarity that unsettled him that nothing about the evening had unfolded according to the script he had written in his mind. There had been no conquest, no cold detachment. Instead there had been hesitation, consideration, a choice made twice rather than once. He turned slightly toward her silhouette in the dim light. "You are certain?" he asked quietly, though the moment had already passed. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze without bitterness. "Yes," she said. Outside, the storm began to weaken, the heavy rain softening to a distant hush. Inside the chamber, something irreversible had taken place, not merely in lineage or contract, but in the quiet recognition that power had not defined the night. Restraint had, and that frightened him far more than duty ever had. Morning arrived quietly, as though the manor itself wished to pretend nothing extraordinary had occurred. Pale winter light slipped through the tall windows of the west chamber, tracing faint gold across the carved ceiling beams and the heavy velvet drapes. Emily woke first. For several long seconds, she did not move. She listened. The storm had passed. No rain against the glass. No thunder rolling across the fields. Only stillness. She became aware of the warmth beside her and the steady rhythm of Duke Alexander Ashford's breathing. It startled her more than the events of the night before. He had not withdrawn to the far edge of the bed. He had not retreated behind cold silence. He slept as though the tension he carried for months had loosened by a single inch. Carefully, she sat up. The fire had burned low to glowing embers. Outside, frost covered the lawns in a thin silver veil stretching nearly 20 acres toward the iron gates. This was no longer a servant's vantage point. It was something far more complicated. She rose from the bed, wrapping a robe around her shoulders, and crossed to the window. The glass felt cool beneath her fingertips. 90 days. The count had begun. Behind her, Alexander stirred. He opened his eyes slowly, disoriented for only a breath before memory returned. He saw her standing by the window, light outlining her profile, and something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Not regret, not obligation, something quieter. "You should rest," he said, voice still rough with sleep. She did not turn immediately. "I am not accustomed to resting in rooms like this," she replied softly. He sat up, drawing the blanket aside, though his expression remained composed. "You will become accustomed," he answered. The words sounded almost protective. She faced him then. There was no accusation in her gaze, only thoughtfulness. "That may not be wise," she said. A faint crease formed between his brows. "Why?" She hesitated, choosing honesty over comfort. "Because when 90 days pass, I must still know who I am." Silence followed, not strained but reflective. He understood her meaning. This arrangement had boundaries. If it succeeded, the child would carry his name. If it failed, she would return to a life that would never feel quite the same. Alexander rose and approached her, stopping an arm's length away. He did not reach for her this time. He only studied her face in the morning light, searching for doubt. "Last night was not a mistake," he said quietly. She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she agreed. "It was not." A knock sounded at the outer door of the chamber, discreet but firm. The manor was waking. Reality pressed in with the day. "His Grace," came Mrs. Hargrove's measured voice from beyond the corridor. "The estate steward requests your presence regarding the southern fields." Duty. It never waited. Alexander glanced toward the door, then back to Emily. The distance between them felt different now. Less formal. More aware. "We will speak again this evening," he said. It was not an order. It was a promise. As he dressed and prepared to leave, Emily remained by the window, watching the frost begin to melt beneath a pale rising sun. The storm had ended, but what had begun inside those stone walls was far more unpredictable than any weather crossing the countryside. Whispers travel faster than winter wind. By midday, Ashford Manor no longer felt silent. It felt watchful. Emily sensed it the moment she stepped into the east corridor after breakfast. Conversations faltered behind half-closed doors. A footman nearly collided with her, then lowered his gaze too quickly. News had not been spoken aloud, yet it had already settled into the walls. Duke Alexander Ashford did not escort women to the West Chamber without consequence. Downstairs, sunlight spilled through tall windows across the marble foyer, melting the last trace of frost from the front steps nearly 100 feet beyond the entrance. The world outside resumed its rhythm. Inside, something had shifted. Emily moved toward the small sitting room adjoining the east wing, determined not to retreat into isolation. If she was to endure this arrangement, she would not hide from it. She selected a book from the shelf, though she did not read. Her thoughts returned to the morning. His promise. His restraint. The quiet way he had said her name. Across the estate grounds, Alexander rode along the southern fence line, reins loose in his gloved hands while his steward spoke of livestock counts and winter supply shipments. He heard none of it clearly. Instead, he replayed the moment she had stood by the window, sunlight outlining her form, and the way she had spoken of identity rather than security. Most would have demanded comfort. She demanded self-possession. That unsettled him. "Your Grace?" the steward prompted gently. Alexander straightened in the saddle. "Proceed with the repairs," he said evenly, returning to duty. Yet even as he spoke, he understood something else required repair. When he returned to the manor just before dusk, the air inside felt charged. Mrs. Hargrove intercepted him near the staircase, her expression measured. "There has been inquiry from Lady Victoria Waverley," she informed him. "She requests an audience this week." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lady Victoria, a widow with influence and ambition equal to any man's. If she sensed vulnerability in Ashford's succession, she would not hesitate to exploit it. "She will be received on Thursday," he replied calmly. His gaze shifted toward the east corridor. "Has there been disturbance?" "Only curiosity," Mrs. Hargrove answered carefully. "Curiosity becomes speculation," he said. By evening, candlelight flickered once more through the west chamber. Emily stood near the hearth when he entered, the fire casting warm glow across her thoughtful expression. She sensed something had changed the moment she saw him. "There are rumors," he said without preamble. "There always will be," she replied quietly. He stepped closer, tension threading through his voice. "Lady Victoria has taken interest." Emily did not flinch. "Then she will look for weakness." He studied her, searching for fear. Instead, he found composure. "We will not give her any," she said. In that moment, he realized she was not merely part of a solution. She was becoming his ally. The fire cracked softly between them, and beyond the stone walls the winter night settled once again across the 20 acres of Ashford land. The world believed this arrangement was born of necessity. What it did not yet understand was that necessity was quietly evolving into something far more dangerous for those who underestimated it. Thursday arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight and quiet anticipation. By mid-morning, Ashford Manor had been polished to perfection. Silver gleamed. Floors reflected light like glass. Every servant moved with heightened precision, aware that Lady Victoria Waverley would cross the threshold before noon. Emily stood in the East Wing dressing room, while Mrs. Hargrove adjusted the deep emerald gown selected for the occasion. It was modest, yet unmistakably refined. Not a servant's dress. Not quite a duchess's either. a statement balanced between worlds. You understand what today represents, Mrs. Hargrove said gently. Emily met her gaze in the mirror. A test, she replied. Downstairs, Duke Alexander Ashford waited in the grand foyer as the carriage rolled across the gravel drive, nearly 100 yards from the iron gates. Lady Victoria stepped down with practiced elegance, her black gloves immaculate, her posture confident. She carried influence the way others carried perfume. Subtle, but unmistakable. Your Grace, she greeted smoothly, offering her hand. Ashford Manor remains as imposing as ever. And Lady Victoria remains perceptive, he answered evenly. They moved toward the sitting room, where tall windows overlooked the frost-kissed gardens. Tea was served. Formalities exchanged. But beneath every polite phrase lay calculation. I hear your estate faces urgency, Victoria remarked lightly, stirring her cup. Succession is rarely simple. Alexander did not react. Succession is managed. Her eyes flickered with amusement. Of course, I am certain you will choose wisely. At that moment, the door opened quietly. Emily entered with measured composure, hands folded, chin lifted. The emerald fabric caught the light as she crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance from the Duke. Victoria's gaze shifted instantly. Sharp. Assessing. And who is this? She asked, voice silk smooth. Miss Emily Carter, Alexander replied without hesitation. She resides in the East Wing under my protection. Protection. The word was deliberate. Victoria's expression barely changed, yet something calculating moved behind her eyes. How generous, she said. Emily inclined her head politely. Lady Victoria. No tremor. No apology. Only quiet acknowledgement. A silence settled that stretched like drawn wire. Victoria set down her teacup. It is admirable when a household values loyalty, she remarked. Though proximity to power can be misunderstood. Emily met her gaze fully now. Misunderstanding often reveals more about the observer than the subject, she said calmly. The statement was soft, but it landed. Alexander felt it in the air between them. Victoria's lips curved faintly. Confidence is refreshing, she replied. Let us hope it is well placed. The remainder of the visit unfolded with careful civility, yet tension pulsed beneath every exchange. When at last the carriage departed, and the iron gates closed once more, Alexander exhaled slowly. He turned toward Emily, who remained composed despite the scrutiny she had endured. You did not yield, he observed. There was nothing to yield, she answered. Outside, winter light glinted across 20 acres of quiet land. Inside the manor, something unspoken had solidified. Lady Victoria had come seeking weakness. She had not found it. What she had found instead was a partnership she had not anticipated. And that realization would not sit quietly for long. The silence after Lady Victoria's departure did not last long. By the following afternoon, the first ripple reached the outer cottages beyond the orchard nearly half a mile from the main house. A stable hand mentioned that Miss Carter no longer returned to the servants' quarters. A kitchen maid whispered that lights burned late in the West Wing. By sunset, speculation had grown roots. Emily felt it before she heard it. A glance held 1 second too long. A curtsy dipped with measured hesitation. She walked the east corridor with steady composure, but beneath her calm something unsettled had begun to rise. Not shame, not fear. Exposure. Duke Alexander Ashford received confirmation of the rumors during his evening meeting with the estate steward. There is talk, Your Grace, the man said carefully, hands folded behind his back. It would be wise to address it before it spreads beyond the county. Alexander's jaw tightened, though his tone remained level. There is nothing to address. With respect, sir, absence creates its own narrative. The steward's meaning was clear. If he did not define the story, someone else would. Later that evening, candlelight flickered through the drawing room, where Emily waited near the hearth. The fire cast warm light against her thoughtful expression, but she sensed the tension in his stride the moment he entered. The manor is speaking, he said quietly. She did not pretend ignorance. And what are they saying? That you have forgotten your place, he answered, the words sharper than he intended. A brief silence followed. Then she lifted her gaze, steady and unyielding. Have I? The question disarmed him. He had not meant accusation. He had meant protection. He exhaled slowly, the weight of expectation pressing against his shoulders. They believe I have elevated you beyond propriety, he clarified. And perhaps you have, she replied softly. He crossed the room, stopping before her. Do you regret it? She considered the question carefully. No, she said at last. But I understand the cost. Outside, wind moved across the 20 acres of darkened fields, bending frost-touched grass beneath the rising moon. Inside, the fire crackled, steady but fragile. Lady Victoria will not remain silent, he continued. She will search for proof that this arrangement weakens my claim. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the mantle. Then we must be stronger than rumor. He studied her face in the firelight, searching for hesitation. There was none, only resolve. You speak as though this is shared, he observed. She met his gaze fully. It is. The words settled between them with quiet force. Not servant. Not obligation. Shared. He realized then that the greater threat was no longer gossip. It was attachment. He had intended this agreement to secure lineage. Instead, it had begun to forge alliance. And alliances, when genuine, were far more powerful than appearances. A knock sounded at the outer door. Mrs. Hargrove entered with measured calm. Your Grace, she said, a letter has arrived from the capital. It bears Lady Victoria's seal. The air shifted instantly. Alexander accepted the envelope without opening it. Emily watched him, sensing the approaching turn. Whatever Lady Victoria had chosen to write would not be mere courtesy. It would be strategy. And strategy, once set in motion, rarely paused for mercy. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Duke Alexander Ashford broke the wax seal without haste, though Emily could see the tension in the way his fingers held the edge. The drawing room was lit only by the fire and 2 tall candles, their flames bending slightly in the draft that slipped beneath the door. Outside, night pressed against the windows, stretching across 20 acres of quiet land that suddenly felt less secure. He unfolded the letter and read in silence. His expression did not change at first. Then his jaw set. What does she want? Emily asked calmly. He lowered the page just enough to meet her gaze. She questions the legitimacy of any future heir born under unconventional circumstances. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was sharp. Emily felt the impact without flinching. She intends to suggest impropriety, she said. She intends to suggest manipulation, he corrected. He stepped toward the fire, holding the letter closer to the light. She claims the council in the capital will require confirmation of lineage and propriety before recognizing succession. Emily absorbed this quietly. Lady Victoria was not attacking with scandal alone. She was laying groundwork for legal doubt. Then she expects you to retreat, Emily said. Alexander glanced at her, a faint spark in his eyes. Or to replace you with a more politically convenient choice. Silence settled between them, but it was not fragile. It was calculating. Emily moved closer, the emerald of her gown deepened by firelight. Will you? She asked softly. The question was not desperate. It was direct. He folded the letter slowly. No, the answer was immediate. Certain. He placed the parchment on the mantel. She believes this arrangement is weakness. She believes you are leverage. Emily studied his face. Am I? He did not hesitate. No, you are not leverage. You are part of the solution. The fire cracked softly, as though marking the shift in resolve. Outside, wind brushed lightly against the stone walls, a quiet reminder that threats did not always arrive with storms. Some arrived written in elegant script. The council will demand proof, he continued. Proof that any child born under this roof carries my name without question. Emily's gaze sharpened slightly. And how does one prove trust? He almost smiled at that. One does not. One proves bloodline. She turned toward the window, watching her faint reflection in the glass. Then we give them no reason to doubt. He stepped closer behind her, stopping just short of contact. That may require public acknowledgement. The implication hung in the air. Not whispered. Not softened. Public acknowledgement meant visibility. It meant placing her beside him in the open, not hidden within the East Wing. It meant drawing a line Lady Victoria could not easily erase. Emily faced him again, steady and unafraid. Then stand beside me, she said quietly. Not behind doors. The simplicity of it disarmed him more than any accusation could. He had begun this arrangement to secure succession. Now he understood that survival required unity, not secrecy. The candle flames flickered as he extended his hand once more, not as invitation to a chamber, but as a declaration of alliance. She placed her hand in his without hesitation. Beyond the walls of Ashford Manor, influence gathered like distant clouds. But inside, something far more formidable had taken shape. Not scandal. Not fear. Resolve. The following morning, Ashford Manor awoke to deliberate movement rather than whispers. Invitations were drafted before sunrise. By noon, sealed notes had been dispatched to neighboring estates within a 50-mile radius, requesting their presence at a formal winter reception to be held at Ashford within the week. It was not a ball. It was not a celebration. It was a declaration. Emily stood beside the long dining table in the grand hall as arrangements unfolded around her. Fresh white roses were ordered from the conservatory. Silver was polished until it reflected candlelight like liquid glass. She understood the message without needing it explained. Duke Alexander Ashford intended to bring her into the open. When he entered the hall, coat still dusted from the brisk wind outside, his expression carried the steadiness of a man who had chosen his course. "The council will attend," he said evenly. "And so will Lady Victoria." Emily did not lower her gaze. "Then let them see what they expect to doubt." He stopped before her, measuring the weight of that resolve. "This will not be gentle," he warned. "Public scrutiny rarely is." She folded her hands calmly. "I have endured worse in silence." The statement lingered between them, quiet but heavy. He realized then that her strength had never required witness. It had simply never been acknowledged. "You will stand at my right when they arrive," he said. "Not as command. As confirmation." "Yes," she replied. Over the next days, preparations intensified. Tailors adjusted gowns. Footmen rehearsed formal announcements. Word spread quickly through the county that Ashford Manor was hosting a gathering of unusual significance. Curiosity sharpened. Speculation multiplied. By Thursday evening, carriages began rolling across the gravel drive nearly 100 yards from the iron gates, lanterns glowing against the winter dusk. Inside, the grand hall shimmered with candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. Emily descended the staircase slowly, dressed in deep sapphire silk that neither concealed her presence nor exaggerated it. She did not look like a servant elevated by favor. She looked composed, intentional. When she reached the final step, Alexander extended his arm. She accepted it without hesitation. The doors opened. Voices hushed. Lady Victoria entered last, her dark attire immaculate, her gaze sweeping the hall with practiced calculation. When she saw Emily standing openly beside the Duke, not hidden in shadow but positioned with deliberate equality, something flickered across her composed features. Surprise. Perhaps even recognition. "Your Grace," Victoria greeted smoothly, though her eyes did not leave Emily for long. "You have arranged quite an evening." Alexander's voice carried across the room with calm authority. "Ashford's succession will not be decided by rumor." The declaration settled like a stone in still water. Murmurs followed, quiet but undeniable. Emily felt the weight of every glance, every measured breath in the hall. Yet she did not waver. She met Lady Victoria's gaze steadily, neither defiant nor submissive. Simply present. Outside, winter air moved across 20 acres of silent land. Inside, under the steady glow of candlelight, the line had been drawn. Whatever challenge awaited from council or society, it would no longer be faced in secrecy. It would be faced together. The music resumed, but it no longer softened the air. It sharpened it. Conversations resumed in polite tones, yet every word seemed to circle back to the same unspoken question. Who was she to stand there? Emily felt it in the way fans paused mid-motion and glasses hovered briefly before lips. She remained beside Duke Alexander Ashford, posture steady, gaze level. If this was to be her trial, she would not look away. Lady Victoria moved through the crowd with measured elegance, greeting council members with calculated warmth. After several minutes, she turned deliberately toward the raised platform near the hearth where Alexander stood addressing two senior estate officials. "Your Grace," she said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention without raising suspicion. Perhaps the council would appreciate clarity. The hall quieted by degrees. Alexander faced her without hesitation. "Clarity regarding what, Lady Victoria?" Her smile was faint, controlled. "Regarding the future of Ashford." Succession depends not only on declaration, but on recognition. Surely you intend transparency. The implications settled across the room like frost. Several council members shifted subtly. Emily felt the weight of their gaze, but did not retreat. Alexander extended his hand slightly toward her, not as display, but as acknowledgement. Transparency is precisely why this gathering was arranged, he replied evenly. Miss Emily Carter stands beside me by my choosing. A ripple moved through the crowd. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Choosing is admirable. Legitimacy, however, is documented. The word struck cleanly. Emily's pulse quickened, but her expression did not change. She stepped forward half a pace, drawing quiet attention. Legitimacy is also defined by honor, she said clearly. The hall stilled. No tremor colored her voice. No apology softened it. Victoria's gaze sharpened. Honor is not recorded in law. No, Emily answered. But integrity is remembered long after law is amended. A murmur followed, not mocking, considering. Alexander watched her with something that had moved beyond strategy. Pride, perhaps. The council chairman, an older man with silvered hair, cleared his throat. Your Grace, the council does not seek scandal. We seek assurance. Alexander nodded once. Then you shall have it. Any child recognized under my name will undergo formal documentation and council verification. He turned slightly toward Emily, his voice lowering but still audible. And that child will be raised without question of its mother's dignity. The declaration was unmistakable. Not defensive, not pleading, firm. Victoria's composure did not falter, but her advantage narrowed. She inclined her head lightly. Then we will await developments. The words sounded like concession, yet beneath them lingered warning. The evening resumed, but something had shifted. Not because the challenge had vanished, but because the alliance had been witnessed. As guests slowly dispersed and carriages rolled back across the gravel nearly 100 yards beyond the gates, the grand hall emptied into quiet. Emily exhaled slowly, tension leaving her shoulders. Alexander stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You did not falter. She met his gaze, the firelight reflecting softly in her eyes. Neither did you. Outside, winter air pressed against the stone walls once more. The battle had not ended. But tonight, the line had held. The manor felt different after the council departed. Not quieter, but steadier. As though the walls themselves had chosen a side. Candlelight had burned low in the grand hall, leaving only faint traces of wax along the silver stands. Beyond the tall windows, winter stretched across 20 acres of open land beneath a sky washed pale with moonlight. Emily stood alone at the edge of the terrace, the cold air brushing gently against her cheeks. She had not expected triumph. She had expected endurance. Yet what she felt now was something deeper. Recognition. Behind her, the doors opened softly. Duke Alexander Ashford stepped onto the stone terrace without announcing himself. For a moment, neither spoke. The night carried the faint scent of frost and distant pine. They will watch us more closely now, he said. At last, his voice calm but thoughtful. Yes, she replied. They will. He moved to stand beside her, not in front, not behind. Beside. The iron gates nearly 100 yards away glinted faintly under the moonlight, a reminder of boundaries that had once defined everything. You understand, he continued quietly, that if this fails, they will not blame circumstance. They will blame you. She turned to face him fully. Then it must not fail. There was no fear in her voice. Only certainty. He searched her expression as though committing it to memory. When he had first summoned her into his study, he had believed he was selecting the safest path, the least complicated option. He had not anticipated the quiet strength that would reshape his understanding of power itself. This began as necessity, he said. It did. It is no longer that alone. The admission hung between them, fragile but undeniable. Emily stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of his presence softened the chill of the air. Then let it become something chosen, she said. The words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any council decree. He reached for her hand without hesitation. No audience, no spectacle, only intent. Whatever comes, he said quietly, you will not stand alone in it. She held his gaze steadily. Nor will you. Inside the manor, a single clock struck midnight. The sound carried across stone and marble, marking not just the passing of hours, but the turning of something far more enduring. The council would demand proof. Society would demand conformity. Lady Victoria would continue her calculated pursuit. But beneath the scrutiny, beneath the politics and expectation, something had already taken root. Not scandal, not convenience, partnership. The winter wind moved across the fields, bending frost-tipped grass beneath a sky that promised eventual thaw. And in the quiet between them, without proclamation or ceremony, they chose not merely to defend a legacy, but to build one together.